Well, g'day everyone. Thanks for coming along today. Well, good morning everyone. Thanks for coming along for the COVID-19 Fiscal and Economic Review. When the private sector falls down, government must stand up. And today I'm very pleased to release the government's Fiscal and Economic Review for Queensland, which charts our course to recovery from COVID-19. Given the extreme volatility of financial markets and the economic position of Queensland, it is difficult, very difficult, because of domestic economic circumstances and international economic circumstances to forecast. At this time, we're adopting the same approach as the Morrison government and other states, and forecasting for 2 years rather than 4. And even then, I must be honest, the challenge of forecasting is harder than it's ever been and more difficult than in previous years. While the global and financial economic situation at MIFA now seems a world away, it's worth recapping where Queensland stood pre-COVID. Prior to COVID-19, the Palaszczuk Labor government was on track to deliver its 5th consecutive budget surplus. The Queensland economy was forecast to grow at 2.5% in 1920, strengthening to 2.75% in 2021. Jobs growth since 2015 had surpassed 250,000. Unemployment had reached its lowest rate since May 2012. We'd seen record exports, over $80 billion a year, continuously outpacing New South Wales and Victoria combined. Government debt, as you can see from this slide, government debt in maroon was lower than both New South Wales and Victoria in absolute terms and as a proportion of revenue. And then COVID hit. As we learned last week, Australia has entered its first recession for almost 30 years. In Queensland, state final demand fell by 5.9% in the June quarter. As painful as that is, Queensland's performance was better than New South Wales and Victoria, who both saw falls of around 8.5%. It's important to bear in mind that those quarterly figures reflect a period before Victoria went into stage 4 restrictions, and before restrictions in Queensland were significantly eased. As the ABS highlighted, the fall in state final demand in Queensland was mitigated by a 4.6% rise in government consumption expenditure, the largest rise of any state or territory, reflecting $7 billion in investment through our Unite and Recover economic recovery strategy, all designed to protect Queenslanders' health, their jobs and businesses. In a time of crisis, that is the role of government. When the private sector falls down due to circumstances beyond its control, government must step up and do the heavy lifting. Sadly, but not surprisingly, those regions where the most jobs were lost early in the pandemic were those most exposed to international tourism, the Gold Coast, Cairns and Sunshine Coast. But across the state, we can see how many of those jobs have now been clawed back. The falls from the dots in this graph to the solid bars. Between mid-March and the 18th of April, when restrictions first came into effect, around 11% of jobs had been lost on the Gold Coast. As of the 8th of August, jobs have been added on the Gold Coast, so the net loss is now 6%. So this was the impact from March to April. You can see the very significant impact on the Gold Coast, but then we've had the clawing back of jobs. Still unacceptable to have that number of job losses, but you see Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Cairns, but there's been an improvement. There's been an improvement. So those regions, as you'll see from that graph, that have fared the best are those that significantly focus on mining and agriculture, which is a testament to Queensland's diversified economy. The point was made by my counterpart, the Western Australian Treasurer Ben Wyatt last week, but it's worth repeating here today. The states that have fared best are those that have controlled their borders, allowing them to open up their economies inside those borders, and I'm pleased that Queensland is right at the front of the pack. ABS data released on Friday shows 5% growth in retail trade in Queensland in July, the second highest growth rate in the nation. ABS building approvals data from last week shows approvals for houses in Queensland rose by over 17% in July, more than double the national average. In the latest ABS payroll jobs and wages data, the number of jobs in Queensland has grown by 5.4% since mid-April, relative to a 4% growth across Australia. But there is no sugarcoating. There is no sugarcoating the impact this pandemic has had on the lives and livelihoods of so many Queenslanders. COVID has taken its toll. Despite the recent improvements in ABS payroll jobs numbers, 138,200 Queenslanders have lost their jobs since the pandemic started. Tens of thousands more face an uncertain future as the Morrison government withdraws JobKeeper payments. Unemployment is forecast to peak around 9% in the December quarter this year. A gradual recovery will follow, but it will be slowed by a number of factors, including a forecast improvement in the participation rate. By the June quarter of 2021, Queensland's unemployment is forecast to be around 8%. So this has had an impact on the fiscal position of the state. We've seen downward revisions in payroll tax, transfer duties, royalties for coal and gas, and to our GST payments. That's the last column there, GST receipts. All up, this represents a $6.7 billion fall in revenue across the 2 years, 1920 and 2021. At the same time, as I noted earlier, our government has invested heavily in protecting jobs and health. Our expenses have accordingly risen by over $3.8 billion for 1920 and by almost $2.9 billion for 2021. In July, I announced our gross general government deficit was forecast to be $8.4 billion. That forecast has now improved slightly to be $250 million less, around $8.1 billion. Going on to borrowings. Now, I know the LNP is particularly fond of using the measure of total non-financial public sector debt. This is a measure that is not used by any other state or by the Morrison government. If the Commonwealth government used it, if the Morrison government used it, their bottom line would include debt carried by companies like the NBN, Snowy Hydro and Inland Rail. Anyone who uses total debt for political purposes does so for one reason. They want to sell publicly owned companies like generators and ports that carry that additional debt. And for 3 elections in a row, the people of Queensland have said that those companies and corporations should remain in public hands. As we look to the last 2 years and this year, we see the increase in general government debt, but not the debt held by those publicly owned corporations. By the end of this financial year, we forecast our gross general government debt to be $60.9 billion, an increase of $1.5 billion from the fiscal update I delivered in July. This is attributable to the decision of government to extend our payroll tax deferral measures, a $300 million increase in derivative liabilities, and an additional $130 million in lease liabilities. Interest rates are, of course, at historic lows, and Queensland's borrowing costs are the same or less than comparable jurisdictions. On 5- and 10-year bonds, Queensland borrowing costs are around the same as the AAA-rated New South Wales and Victoria. Strong borders are delivering for Queensland. And at least right now, strong borders are delivering for Queensland the same as AAA-rated states. On top of that, the total cost of Queensland's borrowings have fallen from $2.3 billion in 2014-15 in that financial year to $1.5 billion this financial year. And I'm advised by Treasury that our borrowing costs will remain below 2014 levels. Let me reiterate that. There is no need to increase taxes to repay this additional debt, because even with this additional borrowing, our interest burden will be less than when Deb Frecklington was the Assistant Treasurer sitting around the Cabinet Budget Review Committee table. This is an important point. At a time when we can increase our borrowings without increasing the tax burden, it's appropriate that we do so to support the economy and Queensland jobs. To take advantage of our ability to access very low interest rates, I'm announcing today that the government will work with local governments in regional Queensland to help them refinance their existing debt on more favourable terms. A number of councils have fixed interest rate loans with rates as high as almost 9%. With QTC's 20-year loan rate currently at 1.92%, refinancing could release as much as $280 million, or 5% of total council operating expenditure in Queensland. That would give councils the ability to put more investment into capital works, supporting more jobs right across the state. The state will expect councils to use this funding for job-creating capital works programs. So from where we were at MIFA, the outlook is undeniably difficult and challenging, but not as challenging in other parts of the world or even other parts of Australia. Queensland's gross state product is forecast to grow by 3.75% in calendar year 2021, compared to an RBA forecast of Australia's GDP to grow by 2%. This follows a forecast 2.5% fall in Queensland GSP in calendar year 2020, compared to an RBA forecast of a 4% fall in Australia's GDP. Strong borders enable a stronger local economy. To help our economy become even stronger, today I can announce that the Palaszczuk government will invest $1 billion through 2 new funds directly into commercial businesses and projects to generate Queensland jobs through the COVID-19 recovery. Business as usual will not cut it now. We will invest $500 million in a renewable energy fund that means our publicly owned energy corporations can increase public ownership of commercial renewable energy projects and support infrastructure. Partnering with the private sector to increase investment, including renewables investment, is a key platform of Queensland's economic recovery plan to support jobs and growth. The Renewable Energy Fund will complement our $145 million commitment announced by the Premier to establish 3 renewable energy zones in our state. Secondly, we will establish the Backing Queensland Business Investment Fund. The fund will operate in a similar fashion to the Victorian Business Growth Fund and the Morrison Government's Business Growth Fund. The fund will target investments in businesses that are small and medium-sized and based in Queensland, will create Queensland-based jobs, have a proven product and defined market opportunity but require significant capital to aggressively build scale or grow market share, are relatively mature, well beyond proof of concept and are profitable or approaching profitability, are seeking capital to expand or restructure operations, enter new markets or finance significant acquisitions, and have well-established and reputable owners who are committed to growing their business from and in Queensland. By putting our money on the table, we can get more projects through the vital investment decision phase sooner, to get construction underway and people employed as soon as possible. The fund will also be empowered to make strategic investments in major Queensland businesses and infrastructure. Asset classes that we may consider investing in include agriculture, property and mining services. We will also consider assets that have been privatised. Take, for example, the Dalrymple Bay coal terminal. Now, Peter Beattie described himself as an idiot for selling the Dalrymple Bay coal terminal. Its owner is on record as wanting to sell. And if the deal stacks up, and if we can drive a hard bargain for Queenslanders, this is the type of investment the fund will consider. I want to be upfront. Both the Renewable Energy Fund and the Backing Queensland Business Investment Fund will be funded from borrowings. But at a time when interest rates could not be any lower, the government makes no apologies for borrowing to invest in Queensland and to bring jobs back. Importantly, the taxpayer will not be responsible for servicing those borrowings. That's because these investments will be commercial. The assets and the investments will be held by government-owned corporations and they will generate revenue that will enable them to service their own debt. I'm also pleased to announce that the government will deliver an additional $249 million from existing funding in COVID-19 related tax relief to small businesses employing Queenslanders. These measures include a 2-month waiver for businesses with payroll of up to $6.5 million for July and August 2020, an extension of the 25% land tax rebate for financial year 2021 to enable landlords to continue providing rental relief to tenants, an extension of the exemption of JobKeeper payments from payroll tax, noting of course that the Morrison government makes those payments subject to income tax, and an extension of existing rent relief to the end of 2020 for businesses renting state government premises and still affected by COVID-19. I'm also announcing today that the government will abolish transfer duty when eligible small businesses restructure to reduce the cost of doing business and to cut red tape as we continue through into recovery. While we focus on expenditure to help drive jobs growth, we must ensure that every dollar the government spends works as hard as it possibly can. To that extent, the government has determined that a number of agencies will be integrated with existing departments to provide greater efficiency and better outcomes for Queenslanders. Firstly, the Public Safety Business Agency. For some time we've been transferring staff in the Public Safety Business Agency back to their relevant home department, typically the Queensland Police Service and the Queensland Fire and Emergency Service. We will now complete that process by transitioning remaining staff back to their home frontline agency by June 2021. This will draw a line under a flawed attempt by the LNP to prepare critical government functions for private sector outsourcing. Building Queensland. To improve the effectiveness and efficiency of our investment decisions, Building Queensland's functions and staff will be incorporated into Queensland Treasury. Building Queensland has done an important job for the government, bringing rigour and discipline to business cases and decision-making. That will continue, as well as all of that important work will continue, but with the staff based in Queensland Treasury. We will commence making administrative changes to give effect to this decision in the coming weeks, and we will consider legislative change to the Building Queensland Act in due course. In line with government policy, there will be no forced redundancies, but some roles may of course change. Moving to the Queensland Productivity Commission now. Given the overriding imperative of addressing the economic challenges of a post-COVID-19 world, the Queensland Productivity Commission will be integrated into Treasury, forming an Office of Productivity and Red Tape Reduction. Like Building Queensland, the Productivity Commission has done a good job for Queensland, but now it's time to power it up within the Treasury. This approach is in line with other states, particularly New South Wales, and the National Productivity Reform Agenda that's now being driven by the National Cabinet and the Council on Federal Financial Relations. This structure will enable greater integration of the government's economic strategy and enhance Treasury's economic policy capability. In line with government policy, there will be no forced redundancies, but again, some roles may change. As with Building Queensland, we will commence making administrative arrangements to give effect to this decision immediately, and we will consider legislative change to the Queensland Productivity Commission Act in due course. I can also announce today that the Office of State Revenue will undertake a debt recovery and compliance program. This program will increase proactive debt management by the State Penalties Enforcement Registry and increase audits and investigations for state taxation and royalties. This will involve increasing the resources of the Office of State Revenue, and I make no bones about that. For an investment of $74.95 million, Treasury estimates these activities will increase revenue and collections by $488.15 million over 3.5 years. And I make no apologies for acting to recover money from those who owe it to the people of Queensland. So in conclusion, we know the path ahead is uncertain and challenging, and we are likely to need further stimulus to support jobs and generate economic growth. To that end, and in addition to the $7 billion package of economic recovery and measures we have announced to date, today I can announce that the government will borrow an additional $4 billion for other stimulus activities. Of this $4 billion envelope, $1 billion will be earmarked for the two funds I have announced today, the Renewable Energy Fund and the Backing Queensland Business Investment Fund. Our additional borrowing reflects the call from the Reserve Bank and the Morrison government for states like Queensland with strong balance sheets to borrow more and to invest. It will bring our total direct COVID-19 recovery stimulus to $11 billion. In the coming weeks and up until the election, we intend to make allocations from that additional $4 billion in surplus, in stimulus. As I've said before, no other state will deliver a full budget before the Federal Treasurer does on the 6th of October. That's the day the Queensland Government enters the caretaker period, so it's not possible to deliver a budget before the October election. If our government has the honour of being returned to government by the people of Queensland with a clear majority, we will deliver a full budget this year. If I'm privileged enough to continue as Treasurer, my intention is to deliver the budget in the week beginning the 30th of November, to be followed by a full Estimates Committee hearing process. We would then return to the regular budget cycle in June 2021. Well, thanks very much for your patience. I know there was a lot there. Happy to take questions on that or any other matters you want to raise.
What would you say to Queenslanders who look at the debt level now and say, well, we were the Ford estimates, it was predicted to be $90 billion. By mid-next year, we're already going to hit $100 billion. What would you say to them the necessity is for that? Is it necessary, really?
Well, the first thing I'd say is $852 billion in Commonwealth government debt. So the federal government has tripled, effectively tripled by the end of financial year, their general government debt. And so we're increasing our debt because we have to stimulate the economy. We have to get Queenslanders, keep Queenslanders in work and get the 130-odd thousand Queenslanders back into work. And that's the priority. As I said, when the private sector falls down due to circumstances beyond its control, government must stand up, step in and do the heavy lifting, and that's what we're doing.
On the public service, you've given us some figures. It looks like, I think the previous figure we had was 229,000, which was released last October. And the total figure is now 232,000.
That's right.
How is that still going up? Why is there a need to keep hiring when there's been warnings that the Auditor General, I think, flagged something earlier this year that you can't afford your wage bill, that sort of thing? Why are you still hiring?
Because we need to continue to fund the front line. We need to continue to provide, as you heard from the government in recent weeks, the new schools that we are opening. They need to be staffed by teachers. We need to keep police officers on the front line. But let me say there's an increase of 3,921.1 full-time equivalent from March 19 to March 20. Now that equates to an increase of 1.7%, which is consistent with population growth of 1.6%. So you have to continue to fund the front line, to grow the front line as a state like Queensland grows.
Forecasting over it though, it says here the 2-year average for full-time growth is 2.2% to this financial year, when population growth is 1.25%. So you're actually forecasting more growth.
We have to grow the front line, Patrick. We're going to continue to do that. I made it clear in July. The 3 priorities of the government were in infrastructure, jobs and funding the front line. There is a cap on non-frontline staff and that will continue, and we're making good progress on that, and I'll be making some more comments upon that in the coming weeks, but we're going to continue to grow the front line going forward, and that's important. I can't give you a breakdown of where the growth is, but it will be significant in health, Stephen, that's right. It'll be in education, it'll be in police, it'll be in corrective services. We're building a new prison. So we have to put staff in those prisons.
On that issue though, you've made, Jackie also made a commitment about a hiring freeze in the middle of this pandemic. Will you be releasing the hiring figures before the election of what's been happening in the last few months so we can see how many people you've hired while, there's obviously been a huge impact in the private sector?
One thing at a time, Patrick. I've given you a significant update today and we'll consider that as we approach the election. So you can thank me later, that's okay.
So you're not going to release this figure of how many people...
No, I didn't say that, Patrick. I didn't say we weren't going to release it. I said I've given you a significant update today and we'll consider that going forward, and you can thank me for those numbers later.
Can I ask you about
yes.
You were saying that the state's economy is performing better with the borders shut. That's sort of counterintuitive when tourism is one of the biggest industries in Queensland. There's no international visitors coming in. Interstate visitors can form up to sort of half of some tourism operators' things. How can you say that it's better for the economy for the borders to be closed? So I know you're going to cite the figures at the national accounts, but there's a lag time in it. Surely it's expected to get worse the longer the borders are shut.
Well, I suppose I'd say a couple of things in response to that, Mark. Firstly, although tourism is a significant and important employer for Queensland, we have a diversified economy. We are less services-based than New South Wales and Victoria. So that gives our economy, I believe, greater strength and resilience in tough times. And because we can keep our community safe, we can keep our community healthy, and we can, as a consequence, drive increased confidence in what's happening in Queensland. We're seeing increased activity, and that's very important to the government. Are we taking strides as big enough or as fast enough as we'd like? Probably not, but we are taking strides forward. We are not going backwards like states like Victoria We have controlled community outbreak. And we see every week a school being closed in New South Wales because it has to go through a deep clean. That has a consequence for those families and those students and for the local economy. So keeping the borders strong has had a good impact on our economy. Yes, there's a long way to go. Unemployment will still be 8% at the June quarter next year, but we are making positive progress, and that's exactly where we want our economy to go.
As the Treasurer holding the purse strings, though, in the longer term, you're going to have more money flowing in once you open up the economy to the rest of Australia.
I hope so. Yes, I hope. We hopefully will have greater activity in our domestic economy here with the borders restrictions as they are now, but hopefully there will be increased revenue, yes, as we expand over time.
Treasurer, when will this renewable energy fund be set up and what sort of projects will be in this fund?
Well, a whole range of renewable energy projects, including generation and storage. So they're two examples of that. And we'll work to develop a mandate for our GOCs. So we'll develop a mandate for our energy GOCs to enable that to commence operation as quickly as possible. It will be hard to do it, I think, before the election, but we were going to start progress on that and get those mandates out as soon as possible, as we will give a mandate to QIC for the Back in Queensland Business Investment Fund. So I want that to progress as quickly as possible.
Why is that fund necessary, though, when there's so much private investment in renewables going on? Why does the government need to double down in that area as well?
Because we've got a target of 50% by 2030. That's just the truth.
You don't think you'll get there without public sector investment?
No, we think this is an appropriate step to take to help accelerate achieving our 2030 target, Stephen. And it's obviously a priority. People were negative about that, didn't think we could get there. Well, we think we can get there, and this is an important step forward for us.
You can only get there by basically having $500 billion government subsidies into renewable energy.
No, we think that's an important step. I'm not ruling out, of course, those GOCs working with private sector investors as well. But there may be a start-up funding that's required, or they may make their own investment into renewable projects. And we've got CleanCo, as you know, that's nation-leading. So these are important actions that we're taking to grow the renewable energy market and generation capacity and storage, can I add, in Queensland.
But things like the
Yes, Jess.
make that $1 billion in investments to business over what time period?
Probably a 3-year horizon, so we'll do it in 3 financial years.
With things like the PSBA and the Productivity Commission
Yeah.
bring that back into Queensland Treasury, is there going to be forced redundancies in that?
No.
So how is that going to actually save any money? Like, you're essentially just shuffling the decks.
It's not principally done to save funding. That's not the reason for it. What I want to do is power up the capacity of the Treasury. So the productivity capacity, I think, in Treasury needs to be enhanced. That's why the 20 staff from the Productivity Commission will come into Treasury. There is a very significant national productivity reform process going on. It's something that all First Ministers have agreed on, that we have to look at improving productivity in the state. So the National Cabinet and the Council on Federal Financial Relations, which is all the state and territory treasurers and the Federal Treasurer, have agreed to progress productivity reform. So we need that enhanced capacity in Treasury. And so we'll be bringing that staff in. There'll be no forced redundancies. We think we'll save about $1 million a year on things like accommodation costs in due course, but it's not driven solely by the savings. Yes, if I can get savings along the way, of course, I'll bank those. But that's not driving it. It's about enhancing the capacity of the Treasury. And of course, as I came over, brought the planning and infrastructure roles over into Treasury, we've got the infrastructure and resilient economy division in Treasury, and that will be enhanced by the staff of Building Queensland. So the activities will continue, but in a new form, in a way that will hopefully accelerate outcomes for Queensland. Yes, Claire?
Just on borders, you mentioned Gold Coast and Cairns. What's your long-term plan for those communities, though, given that international borders won't be open?
Well, as part of our economic recovery plan, there's a number of stages that's rolling out as part of that. We've got our 6 focus areas. But then, of course, we're going to do regional planning, a regional planning process for that as well. So there will be more work that we will do for those communities. We were just in Cairns last week, and there's no doubt that Cairns is doing it very tough because of, as Mark and others have identified, their exposure to international tourism, overseas tourism. Now, that's something that's entirely beyond Queensland Government's control. International borders are controlled by Scott Morrison, and he needs to find a way to get 23,000 Australians back into Australia. He seems to be struggling with that concept to begin with. But when we open the borders, that will help them. But we've announced more initiatives last week to assist the tourism industry in the far north. So I think targeting, as part of that strategy, we're going to release regional plans, but then targeted support as our communities need it going forward.
Are you comfortable fighting the election on the state of the books as they are today?
Yes, I'm very, very confident about fighting the Queensland election on the basis of Labor's economic management. And Deb Frecklington needs to explain, as a consequence, if you've got $23 billion in election commitments, and that's where they are now, $15 billion for the Bradfield scheme, which they keep saying they're going to build, and $8 billion in other commitments. She needs to say to Queensland, tell Queensland what she will cut, because they've said they're not going to borrow anymore. I've laid out what we're going to borrow. I've said we'll borrow $4 billion additional in the medium term over the forwards. If they're not going to borrow anymore, if they're going to keep expenditure to revenue, and the Shadow Treasurer has said that, then the only way they can deliver on their promises is to cut. And they need to say when, where, who and how they are going to cut to deliver their promises. Otherwise, their promises have been entirely meaningless, and I don't believe that's the case. I believe they're going to deliver that, and they need to reveal that to Queensland. Yes. No, it's doing what the Governor of the Reserve Bank and the federal government have asked us to do, and that is to borrow more, to invest in Queensland, particularly infrastructure, and to create jobs. So that's what we'll do, and I want to thank our Treasury officers for working hard on assisting to pull that together. Yes.
Projections based on the assumption that the borders will stay closed indefinitely?
There are a number of assumptions that are set out in the Fiscal and Economic Review. They are not predicated on the borders staying closed indefinitely, but there are a number of assumptions, including the delivery of a vaccine in mid-2021. The closure of the international borders have been factored in, but the assumption is not that they will continue to remain closed indefinitely. Who hasn't had to go? We might go up to the back. Sorry.
When does it assume that the borders will open?
We haven't. We have not made a determination on when the borders will open. We've made our best forecasting effort for this last financial year and this financial year, based on current circumstances as we see them. Sorry.
Agencies to Queensland Treasury, are there going to be any voluntary redundancies? You mentioned those.
No, we don't anticipate there'll be any voluntary redundancies in the short term. There'll be role changes, but we will bring everybody in, and we will just get them powering up within Treasury, just working in a different way.
Are we due for another credit rating downgrade, do you think?
I don't believe so, no. And that's the current policy position of the government, is to work to ensure we maintain our credit rating where it is.
And you said there's no need to increase taxes to pay for the additional debt.
Yes.
Is that you ruling out any tax increase?
As I've said in the Parliament, we have Queenslanders are doing it so tough at the moment. Queenslanders as individuals, as families and as businesses are doing it tough. We don't have any intention of increasing taxes or revenue at this stage. I cannot say what the future holds. It's why we can't forecast really beyond 30 June next year. But we're confident about where we are. We're confident about keeping our economy strong, our borders strong, and our people safe, and that will allow a pathway out of this.
You can't rule out any new or increased taxes post June 30.
June 30 next year. It's not the current position of the government to increase that. Well, I can't rule out indefinitely what the revenue position might be, but we've made a clear position, for example, on coal royalties. We've struck an agreement with the coal industry. Royalties will remain where they are for 3 years as part of establishing the Regional Communities Infrastructure Fund. But I have not factored in any revenue increases, in the process that I've outlined today.
Tim Anza's promised
I might come here and then come back to you, Patrick. Yes.
The government released a roadmap
Stephanie.
for easing restrictions in April. That included a plan for when the borders reopen. So I'm just curious why you can't estimate when the border might reopen, given that arguably we're actually in a much better position now. So why can't you estimate when the border would reopen?
Because we don't know the course that the pandemic will take.
But you didn't know it in April either, and yet you were able to nominate the date.
Well, the government said, and the Premier said, we'll take the advice of the Chief Health Officer and we will do it month to month. And I think, to be fair, if you look at that opening strategy or the removal or the lowering of restrictions, at each stage there is a COVID-safe checkpoint, and that happens at the end of each month. And so, absent any changes, we had a plan to open. We did that. We did that in accordance with that in July, the 10th of July. We then had uncontrolled community transmission in New South Wales and Victoria, and then we acted to secure Queensland's borders again. So I mean, I can't predict what the virus is going to do. You know, there's only one reason for the virus, and that's to infect another human being. So we're seeing great positive results in Victoria, and the pathway to the removal of restrictions is very significant, as announced yesterday by the Victorian Premier. New South Wales is managing community transmission the best it can, but we'll take the advice of Jeanette Young. That's what we'll do.
You said that the Treasury made assumptions on the vaccine being available in mid-2021, but no assumptions on the Queensland border reopening?
No, not at this time.
Give us a glib Treasurer's summary of where the budget is at the moment.
I think the circumstances for Queenslanders are challenging. This is a difficult time, but we're making positive progress, and that's because of the great work of Queenslanders. I'll come back to you, Stephen.
Tim Manders promised that debt's going to stabilise and not go up under him, and I guess you're giving him a figure now that he's going to have to keep to. Is that possible, and will you offer the same guarantee?
No, I've set out the debt pathway for us, and so he needs to say how is he going to fund $23 billion in election commitments. That's what he needs to do based on his current fiscal principles, and he's enunciated those in the Parliament. So unless he's misleading the Parliament, they're his principles. He's put them out there. He's talked about, I think, the 5 fiscal principles he has, including not letting stabilising debt and not borrowing any further. So it's up to him to explain that, Stephen. Yep. Jack, sorry.
Public service figures, there's an extra 4,000 public servants earning over $120,000 a year in the 6 months to March. That's an increase of about 16%. How does the government justify those figures?
Look, you'll have to put those questions to the Public Service Commission. I don't have the detailed breakdown of that. I do have the global number, but very happy for you to put those to the Public Service Commission. Yes, Jess. Well, there's a number of activities that we've agreed to progress as Treasurers, and there's a number of things we've done. So land use and planning is a very significant matter nationally that we're looking at. So how we, and I've said publicly what we've done in Queensland. Reforms around how business operates, how government interacts with businesses, so better regulating. We've even at the Council on Federal Financial Relations look at how charitable institutes, entities can work better across state borders. So we've got high-level issues about how the labour market will work, to how we better use land, to how do we make the non-government sector work. So all of those issues are being considered, and we can do that at a state level as well. And I'll have more to say about regulatory reform going forward as well. There's a number of actions we've taken.
In March, the government announced $500 million to help workers find jobs. How many people has that helped get back into work?
I don't know the number, Damani, sorry, but I'm happy to get that, get back to you.
That $500 million?
Beg your pardon?
Is that being carried across the $500 million? Or?
Yes, that's principally where that would come from, but there are other initiatives that are supporting workers as well.
Can I just ask you one question not related to the economic review? Tim Mulherin, the former deputy Labor leader, has passed away.
Oh, that's just tragic, very, very sad news, particularly as it comes after Father's Day. Tim loved his wife Erin and his children more than anything, and for all of those of us in public life, our family is everything to us. They're there before we go into the arena. They're there during the time we're in the arena, and then they're there when we come off. So Tim made an enormous contribution to our party. He was a great bloke. I think, as many of you know, he was a great bloke to have a beer with and a yarn with. He loved to have a yarn. But the face of Mackay, the current face of Mackay, was to a very large extent chiselled by the hands of Tim Mulherin. He made an enormous difference to his community. He loved his community greatly as well. And I think Tim also distinguished himself in the way that he worked so hard during opposition. They were extremely difficult times. I know Annastacia will be deeply saddened by the loss of Tim today because they worked so well together. He was the deputy leader. This was the darkest time our party had ever faced, and Tim was there every day, standing up for the party, standing up for the people that he believed in. And it's a deep loss that all of us in the Labor Party feel, but it will be a deep loss for the community of Mackay and also Queenslanders who knew Tim. Okay, thanks everyone.